Welcome to Recession podcast, where we discuss entrepreneurship, industry trends, and the occasional book review. How do you take a successful service business and turn it into a $100 million tech titan? Our guest today did exactly that. After starting in the trenches of the company's telemarketing department, he rose to the top to lead a digital revolution in the language industry. Joshua Gould, appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Dalton.
So today we're just going to be discussing a couple topics. The agenda, the planned agenda is just talk about how the CEO or professional managers are shifting away from, like, I would say, people managers to like a technical product builder. And then talking about how the AI disruption cycle is similar to what we've seen in the past with the internet boom and bust. And then how capital is the way to create your moat and why internal profits aren't enough. And then if we have time, we'll touch into the apprenticeship programs versus like a traditional college approach. And I think there's a trend that we're seeing, and Joshua knows more, and Josh knows more about that than I do. And we can touch on his approach with the apprenticeship program. And then the last thing is maybe some anecdotal information on entrepreneurship, and I think the premise of it is just getting stuff done. So before we dive into all of that stuff, do you want to provide a background, more detailed background, like of yourself, Josh?
Yeah, sure. I won't go back to kindergarten. I'll save the listeners from hearing that part of the story. But I moved to the US at 21. I never went to college. I started out in Coors Brewers selling beer to pubs in England, learned to sell, and then came to sell language services in the big word. And I started out telemarketing. I did the night shift selling to the US. And then we decided to come and open up a US office, which is how I ended up here 21 years ago. So half my lifetime. And I mean, that's the story I like to tell people, but the parties were a big draw as well in New York City, especially as I kind of like exhausted London and it was time to move on. So I came to the US, and we were actually a language agency, a translation agency. We had built a really good web service API into the back end of a lot of banks, and we would do their equity research documents. So I started a small office on Wall Street, and that was just before the collapse and the Great Recession. And the crazy thing then is, like, I just got here, I just signed up some clients, got going, and all of a sudden, and I lived on Pine Street behind Wall Street, and I would be going home and I would see my clients walking with like boxes down the street. And everyone was fairly optimistic even then. You know, they would be like, okay, don't worry, we got you in the next bank we go to. Mm-hmm. But it didn't work out that way. You know, it was a bloodbath, and it was much worse than people thought. And I realized I had to pivot to government contracting because George Bush was president at the time, and he had this crazy bill to spend, you know, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars through government contractors. So we pivoted at that point to selling to government rather than banks. And it was really the time when we decided as well that we had to automate workflows, because we just couldn't be competitive in a government acquisition environment, which is a lot more stringent than relationship-based banking. Mm-hmm. So we did that, and, you know, we opened a defense business to support in Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria with human intelligence. And the business has just become more and more technical and gone further and further away from the translation agency it started with.
Just a natural progression. Yes. And the translation agency is the big word, right? And then there's a portfolio of companies under that umbrella, correct?
Yeah, so the big word is the name of the company, and our apps all are under something called WordSync. So it works a bit like Uber. So you have your taxi app, and that's the one that you can click on, and and in my case, an interpreter will show up, not a taxi driver. You can also get one on video, like we could have an interpreter on the line now if we didn't speak the same language.
Maybe if you're from Liverpool, we might need an interpreter.
We have some regional accent interpreters for sure. I need them myself when I go to England. I've lived here too long, and then we have AI in there as well. You can have an AI linguist. We have subtitling, dubbing, editing, all the translation, which is the written word, all through an app, and you can get that on your equivalent of your Uber taxi app. But then 15,000 linguists have the actual taxi app, which is, their app. And we say that's a business in a box. So they can accept and decline work. They're mainly 1099 workers, and they can invoice us through the application. And then our own staff across the globe have their app, which is really the administrative or management side of it. And about 80+% of all of our requests are not touched by any one of our employees. It's entirely done through the applications, whether it be the spoken word, whether someone shows up in person in a police station in Amsterdam, and we do about 50% of the Dutch police calls, or whether it's someone in Medicare or Medicaid appointment in the US. It doesn't matter whether it's over the phone interpreting and that'll be done by human, whether it's done by AI, it's all really done through the app. And that was the huge evolution. And I can get into it if you want, but we went through many AI disruptions all the way back to 1998.
Yeah, let's dive into it. I think everyone's got the background of the big word and the kind of the gist of it. And I think now is a good pivot to discussing what changes you're seeing or that you've seen over the years, and then bring that back to what people know historically is like the Dotcom bust or these other type of big disruptions.
Sure. So a lot of people are saying we've never seen anything like this AI revolution. And I beg to differ. I don't think you have to go back to the industrial revolution. I think you can just go back to the 90s and the dot-com boom or bust. And, I don't know how old your average audience member is, but I'm 43.
I think the analytics is like 27 to 35 is the majority of the audience.
Yeah, so I can explain very simply. There was this thing, it was invented by the US Army called the World Wide Web. We now know that as the internet. And everyone would say that was going to change the world, and it absolutely did. And all these companies, just like we see now with AI, started popping up. And different to what we see now was a very immature investment market. So people were taking life savings. Companies were balance sheet investing in these startups that didn't really have a product, but more of a promise. They were solutions looking for problems. And some of those were legit. So your eBays, your PayPals, your Googles, they all started in those days. And all of a sudden there was this great big boom and we had the internet. And before that, you had to fax your translation work to our office, and we would sit there with those clickers, like when you're going in and out of a club. And that's how we counted words.
How do you manage
how we
that?
charge people. So there was no Microsoft Word. There was Lotus Notes. That was exciting. Probably your viewers don't know Lotus. So, but it was an IBM version of Microsoft Office, and it was all insane. And then around, I think it was 98, 99, the bust happened. And that was where a lot of these businesses, they didn't really add any value on top of the internet. They weren't really doing anything. And, they just went from billions of dollars of valuation overnight to zero, and people lost a lot of money. But there were some good companies that solved real problems, like Google, sorted through all of the content and indexed it. And it was a good solution. Like you could find the websites that you needed to find. eBay allowed like anyone to open up a virtual store. PayPal allowed us to pay. But the big issue with it was logistics, because everything had to catch up. You could sell your antiques to a Chinese dealer in China through eBay, but how do you get your antique to China? Well, there wasn't an easy way to ship it back in those days, and it was very expensive. So all the same stuff that you're seeing now, talked with AI, where we've got solutions to problems, but there's too many missing components to really make it, electrifying yet. That's going to come. And I argue that we've had AI for a very long time. I give the example of my thermostat. Since I was a kid, and I'm in my 40s, you could, twiddle the dial and it would send an electronic signal to your boiler and change the temperature in your home. And that's artificially intelligent. So what we're seeing now when people talk about AI, they're talking about large language model, which is like generative AI. And but we've had AI disruptions throughout history. And in the 90s, in my business, there was something very similar to what we see today, where you could reuse pre-translated content. And 70% of all the words that we were charging for, and we were charging like 15 cents a word, and 70% of them just disappeared overnight because there was something called translation memory. And what we found was, and there was a big argument in the boardroom. Should we go and tell our clients? Our biggest client was Honda. Should we tell them that 70% of the manuals don't need to be translated anymore? And we just acquired a company called Mitaka out of Japan for this client. And all of a sudden, they didn't look like such a good deal. So we decided to go ahead and tell them. And they were so happy. And they said to us, guys, we weren't even spending 1% of what we need to spend. And basically their revenue continued to grow, even though 70% of, there was a 70% discount essentially. And then you get to say like 2013, and there was something called neural machine translation, which is neural AI. And, we called it machine learning. I think all AI is machine learning. If you ask me, it's just been rebranded. But neural is large language model. It is what we call AI today, except instead of it being large language model, and therefore using the whole internet and YouTube and everything else to tune it, you are now really, very focused on a small data set, and that's corporate. So Google came out with this, and their first big use case was to essentially try and eradicate translation businesses. And we were pretty scared of it. But, again, necessity is the mother of all invention. And we built orchestration tools around it. And we built the wraparound. So the subtitling, the dubbing and editing, and e-learning took off because of this. It became really cheap to create content and then sell it. And the best value content is content that people will pay for because they're actually going to learn something. So, e-learning became big, SCORM packages, Moodle, these are open source programs for e-learning content. And we went into that business as well. And we were very much a government contractor at the time. So we were doing a lot of interpretation, and that's the spoken word. But it was very expensive, and it took around 18 different processes to get an interpreter on site. Think of it as like a temporary employment agency. Like
I'm sure there's a lot of security in those scenarios.
Yeah. So we automated that whole bit, and we went from an operations cost in the teens of 20% of our revenue down to 4% of our revenue. And that was through like artificially intelligent workflows. I described them back in the day before everyone used AI and machine learning as self-driving workflows. And that really, again, it saved the business, and it made us very, very competitive price-wise as well. And, so we continue to grow. And, as of today, we have 15,000 human interpreters. We have billions of combinations of machine learning engines that can do, to a far lesser extent what the humans can do. And every single day, we receive tens of thousands of requests, mainly from police stations, from hospitals, from military sites. A lot of our linguists are terrorist cleared, various versions of secret cleared. And it's an exciting business. And, I wake up every single morning, Dalton, to try and eradicate the final barrier of communication, which is, of course, language, and really help governments communicate with their population so we can get them in work and we can get them paying taxes and we can get them operational, because we're in a major crunch of people. You look at the jobs report and it's very, very short term, right? It's a month. It's looking at a month. You can go back a year, but over the next 2-3 decades, if we want to compete with China and India as a nation, as in the US or my other nation, which is the UK, we've got to deploy people. And we've got to deploy AI to make those people more efficient. And I think that our governments really understand that right now, which is why they're really working hard to get as many people in work as possible.
Josh, you touched on a lot of points there. I mean, a lot of great information. Some things that I thought was interesting was your point about AI being a thing for a while. And that's completely true. You learn in school when you're doing these tech classes, like AI is like a sphere of many different operations. Like AI is like one, it's not necessarily one thing, it's many different things. It could be automation, it could be machine learning, it could be all these things. And LLMs and its use cases, Gen AI, but it has been the, I guess, main weight or pull towards the word and term AI, where it's not necessarily AI. There's many things that are AI, and AI has been around for a while, just not as prevalent as it is now with this Gen AI revolution. And then another thing that I thought was interesting was just like the natural evolution of the company after the pivot, where it was, you saw that corporations were going to be having a hard time with after the events of the Dotcom bust. So you pivoted to government contracts, and I assume that's somewhat of a workflow restructuring, a contract approach. And then after that, there was like a natural progression, so like from governments to municipalities, and then now there's the, I guess the way you explained it the best is like the Uber translation app, which is really cool. And then you just keep progressing and I would say improving the orchestration infrastructure for language translation.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, a lot of people, let's face it, no one's really building AI, unless you are called Anthropic or Google.
Yeah.
You're not really building AI. What you're doing is you're building orchestration tools, you're building improvement tools, you're building wraparound tools. But here's the good news. And a lot of people I know are very scared of AI. And I tell them you don't need to be scared of it. It's not like Anthropic wants to make a product exactly for your client's use case. And even though my client's a government and Anthropic does sell to my clients, or at least it did until 5 minutes ago, they're not doing they're not doing the QBRs, the quarterly business reviews. You don't get a CEO to a QBR if it's Anthropic, and they're not doing the Cyber Essentials Plus, and they're not doing the ISO 27001, and they're not guaranteeing it's staying. The data is going to stay where they said it's going to stay for that particular client, and they're not giving you the ability to put human in the loop. And they're not giving you the ability to switch entirely. I have a lot of clients who start out with simple AI calling to our software and then switch over midway into human video because it's become too technical, like a medical. This happens all the time in a medical setting. So Anthropic's not going to do that. And, unless you're solving a problem for 8 billion people that's going to make potentially 100 plus billion in revenue, you're probably not on Anthropic or Gemini's or any other of these few manufacturers of it. You're not at risk. And
Yeah.
the other thing, this is an interesting statistic. The guy that built the AI for Microsoft told me. He said that 99% of every translated word on the internet is through AI. And I don't doubt that. But my industry grew last year 6%. And that we're doing a lot of translation. So that means that 1% has got so huge because we're so used to reading everything now in our own language. The whole internet was in English, not too long ago. But we're so used to buying now in English and calling up a call center and speaking English. But guess what? It wasn't the case for a Chinese person or a Gujarati speaker or I'm in Miami, a Haitian Creole speaker. Now they can do that for the first time ever. So businesses are capitalizing on that. So the macroeconomics of AI are explosive. People are very focused on the micro, what they do, their market, their addressable market. And I say your market size will be thousands of times, not tens or hundreds, thousands of times bigger because of AI. And yes, AI might take a good share of your market, depending on what your market is, but the small percentage will be much bigger in real dollar terms than it is today. And that's what I've seen in our business. Yeah, our business over the last 30 years has grown by about an annual 6%, despite constant AI disruptions.
I think the premise of that is just don't be scared, just dive in, right?
Yeah, what's the worst that can happen?
So I think the next topic about that is you went through and led a big revolution, and I think it's a difference of mindset and skill set with this big transition of a technology stack for a lot of these companies. Like, the expectation isn't that you'll think about using LLMs or this Gen AI. It's like, how are you doing that to make your organization more efficient? And how are you making sure that the organization is galvanized and executing consistently on a pace that outpaces their competitors?
That's a huge question, Dalton. And I think that this is, I'm hearing by major investors and, on a regular basis, people aren't adopting the AI quickly. We're spending a lot of money on building out AI products that no one's buying. And it makes total sense, right? Because if you're the call center manager, and I have a call center of a couple of hundred people, and you know that bringing in an AI agent is going to make your call center infinitely more profitable and it's more scalable, do you want to bring in the AI agent? Now, in theory, the answer is yes, but we're dealing with humans. And the humans are like, well, now there's only 1 degree of separation between me and the robots. And they'll try and legitimize their decisions in their head of, it can't do it as well as I can. It's going to upset people. It's going to damage the brand. And their managers are now only 2 degrees from the robots. And I think it's innate in humans to want to empire build. So again, AI becomes a threat. So there's a natural bias against AI, even if you understand its power, even if you think it's great, even if you really know what you're talking about, you're still thinking there's a bias behind it. On the other hand, most people don't have the ability to integrate AI, because what does that actually mean? What do I do? Like, do I go to Anthropic's website, download a cloud engine or a Claude engine, whatever you want to call it?
Mm-hmm.
And then what do I do? Where do I plug it in? And that's a big issue. These manufacturers are making airplanes and then they're selling it to people who aren't pilots. And right now there's no air traffic control system and there's not enough runways to take off from. So, it's another roadblock, right? And all of this will be resolved in time.
With the
But if,
infrastructure, you made a good point earlier about the infrastructure. The technology is
yeah,
there, the infrastructure isn't there. Even though the worker skill set, like leader skill set, is not necessarily mature to handle the new transition.
yeah, I read something really interesting the other day, and that is that CEOs have been fired at alarming rates. And that 80% of all new CEOs are first time CEOs. And I can see exactly why, because CEOs who are battle hardened because of COVID and all the disruption, they're saying, hang on a second, they're like pilots. They're saying, first, we just got to aviate, and then we got to navigate out the situation. And then we'll communicate exactly how we do it to you. And boards are saying, well, I can't wait that long. I've just invested $500 million into your business. And, I'm not going to wait until you figure this out. If and some junior, senior leader sticks their hand up and says, I'll figure it out. So that's why you're seeing 80% of CEOs being replaced by middle and kind of senior middle management who are saying that they'll figure it out. And maybe that is the right thing to do. Maybe you need that blind confidence. But even when you do that, you've got to have great data. The big word has these applications, and we learned the hard way that when the data isn't available and it's not good, technology scales negatively. It creates a problem that exists in the manual human world, and it makes it very big very quickly, and it can get out of control. So you've got to also have databases and data. And if you're not a tech company already, or like a SaaS business, well, it's really hard to do that. And that can I think that will take 5 years for most companies to do that. But if you are enterprising and you can figure it out, I mean, it will give you a short-term advantage. And that's all it's going to give you. It's going to give you a short-term advantage. There will be a time when all your competitors have the exact same AI as you, and then it's a tax. It's just something you've got to do and got to pay for, but you've got no advantage over it. So I would encourage all your listeners, Dalton, to make sure that you get ahead of this, because if you can get a 2-3 year advantage to your competitors, you can then build on that in other ways outside of AI and stay ahead. And that's what we're trying to do at the Big Word with AI.
You had quite a bit of advantage though with all the data that you have, like 30 years of data. That's huge.
I hope so.
Like a gold mine. I think there was a point about the bias against AI, and I thought about a similarity when somebody gives you pretty harsh feedback. People have the first tendency is to be defensive, but the feedback could be true or not be true. But the first action people typically have is to be defensive, like, oh, Josh doesn't know what he's talking about, or whatever it may be. But if you just take a breath and really think about the situation, it's clear what you need to do, right? Like I think if you look at it with a wider lens and take that kind of perspective versus just about me or the micro instead of the macro, and say, okay, well, if I'm going to automate this call center and maybe the employees working on the call center are elevated to handle higher escalated calls, like maybe ones that are very serious or security related, then the AI is not used. It's human. And then we're verifying that the calls were interpreted correctly or whatever it may be. That may be uncomfortable, but if you don't do that, then the issue that gets created is if your competitors do the same thing that you did not want to do, then your opportunity is gone because you're not competitive and they took your contracts. And that hurts. That doesn't hurt just the person who didn't make the decision. It hurts all the employees that were there. And they were great people. They don't necessarily have to do that job. They could do something else. If you've got great people, you can move them into another position. You can upskill them.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than working for a manager who loves their team so much that they love them to death. And what I mean by parents know what I'm talking about.
Yep.
they're trying to protect them by resisting AI, by resisting change. But actually, all you're doing is harming their career. You're keeping them in a position, in a job that's probably not going to exist in a few years, rather than allowing them to move on with their life. And I see this over and over again. In fact, some of the managers that I've hired who are loved the most were very guilty of this. And you need that tough love. I'm a father. And if I went to my two daughters and said, guys, don't worry, do whatever you want to do, be a musician, be this, be that, I've got your back. Like, I'm going to buy you a house, I'm going to buy you a car, I'm going to make sure food is always on the table. I'm taking away the hunger and the necessity. And as humans, we won't do things without hunger and necessity most of the time. And, so what you have to realize is your competition are going to adopt AI. They may not all adopt AI, and they may not all adopt it quickly, but a few will. And if you are seen as a lagger, it doesn't matter how good your relationships are, how much they like you, they can't stay with you because AI speeds up delivery. It makes it cheaper. It can do quality control, and it can do so many things that you just can't compete with. So what's going to happen is you're going to lose the contracts. And to your point, Dalton, then you've got no point, then you've got no choice but to lose the people. And all of a sudden, these people are going to be lost on the job market in the worst time possible, when every other person who closed their eyes to the AI threats and opportunities, are pushing their own workforce, onto the street. So it's going to be a massive challenge. And if you're working for a company who's not quick enough on this AI train, I would seriously, if I were you, I would be looking for another job, no matter how much I like that company, because I'd be very worried about what's going to happen in the near future.
And then another point about this analogy that we're working through is, if those contracts are gone and the employees have to be let go because there's not enough revenue, they never got upskilled. So they are now have to reskill without a job, versus if you made a decision first off, then you could upskill your employees. And if they wanted to leave and go somewhere else or move on or do their own thing, that's fine. But like, it's almost like a critical failure point if that's
absolutely
the
right. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, you can't learn these things, at a 30-year-old or as a 35-year-old in the classroom. You're not realistically going to go back to school to do AI courses in the middle of your career. Just like my parents never went back to, learn the internet. They did some night school on Dreamweaver to try and understand what a website was. That's when you would code a website.
Yeah, Dreamweaver was pretty cool.
Yeah, it'd be basic like HTML coding, but you might go and do that. And I would encourage people to do that. Well, you'll just listen to podcasts like this and you'll get the same kind of education. But you're going to have to learn on the job. And that's how my father used to, always complain to me to say that our technology came with no instruction manual. And I said, but no one reads the instruction manual anymore. And if you do need to read it, you probably shouldn't be working for a tech-enabled company like us. And that's reality. So you're right. You've got to put your employees in positions that they have to figure it out, that they have to utilize it. And it's an education in of itself. And you have to do this as a team, because as a CEO, the big word, I don't have all the answers. I'm not a techie guy. I might understand a lot about technology, but I can't go and code this stuff myself. And so I have to build a team around that. And we have to, my receptionist now has to be able to use AI to figure out who someone is as they're walking in, and get as much information out the database as possible about them, so we can greet them in a way that they wouldn't be able to be greeted normally. And Ross, who sits on our reception, has to do that. But he also has to, like, when the toilet's backed up and broken, call the plumber.
Mhm.
or the facility manager. So it is hard. This is really hard, but it's exciting. So I would, encourage everyone, enjoy this ride. It's not that serious, this thing called life. You're going to be dead at some point, and you're not going to think to yourself, I wish I just hung on to that job for a little bit longer or a few more days, or I really like the office space and the coffee was good. You know, you're not going to think about it. You're going to say, I wish I took life by the hands and, or the horns, sorry, and just grabbed it and just went with it and just threw caution. So I promise you, I've imagined myself, I know this makes me sound crazy, on my deathbed and thinking, what would I wish? And I do this as an exercise. What would I wish I'd done differently? And it's nearly always, I wish I'd taken more risks. I wish I'd made that investment. I wish I'd done that trip with my family. I wish I'd bought a boat. So guess what I do, Dalton? I do it all the next year. And which makes me an exhausting husband.
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point though. Just to don't get wary about it. Don't lean just don't get wary, don't get hesitant, lean in. What's the worst that could happen? Like you learn a new skill or you upskill yourself and that's not utilized at your job, but that might make you a wiser person or make you more efficient or make you more interesting. It's not a big deal. And if it's a complete waste of time, which it most likely isn't, so what? Like it is what it is. It's
You
not
know
that
what? You
serious.
had fun. You had fun.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
journey. My favorite days on this planet are days I'm a boater. So, I have no idea where I'm going. I come out my marina, and I have to decide, do I turn left, do I turn right? And then I just go and I see, and sometimes we barbecue, and sometimes we anchor, and sometimes we dock and dine.
Mhm.
But it's a great metaphor to life. You don't need a boat, by the way. You can have a second-hand used kayak off Craigslist, and you can have, I think just as much fun, probably with less people, but you can have just as
Yeah.
much fun, it's a great metaphor for life. Just do it, go for it. As long as, I think for a family household, you need to earn at least $100,000. That's going to take care of your food, your health care. You're not going to be looking over your shoulder. You're going to have a little bit of money for a rainy day fund. And if you don't, it's just because you're overspending and that's a choice. But after that, go and have fun. This AI stuff is going to be fun. It is fun. I mean, I call up our AI call center all the time. She's called Ava. And I ask her, can you sing me a song about the big words? Can you tell me a joke? And it's not a real relationship. It's, it doesn't mature. There's no trust there, but it is fun. And I love demoing it to people.
Yeah, life can be a treat if you want it to, for sure.
Yeah.
Speaking now about treats, what about capital treats? So, in our pre-interview, you discussed kind of the change of what is needed to survive as a company, and one
Okay.
of those
So,
things is raising capital versus trying to rely on just internal revenues to scale.
yeah, I mean, since we spoke, Dalton, I mean, the private capital markets, it's been a bloodbath. I would say this is probably the opening salvo to a major crisis. And for your listeners who don't know what I'm talking about, there is a company, I believe it's called Blue Owl, there's Apollo, there's Blackstone. These are companies with hundreds of billions of dollars of assets under management. And there's essentially been a run on the banks. Businesses have not performed as well. They taken out a lot of money and they've deployed that money on Rolls Royces when sometimes, a Ford will do. And we've all seen that. If you're in the tech space, you know how much people are spending on building technology compared to probably what they need to build these minimal, lovable projects. So companies that can generate cash now are becoming very favorable. The big word is a cash generative company. And yes, we spend many millions of dollars in building AI tools a year, but we have to generate cash. And you need cash to build these tools. This isn't free. This is very, very expensive. They're capital intensive. And that's why you saw the Oracles of the world and all these huge companies going out, borrowing tons of money over the last 6 months, even though they generate a lot of money themselves, because they're creating a war chest and they know that this is AI is an infrastructure play for them as much as it is a software play. So they've got to build. I read that Elon Musk is actually building his own power plants now, and they even have changed the law to help Silicon Valley companies being able to own and operate utility companies. So they're not diverting too much electricity away from me and you who just want to watch YouTube.
Yeah, we're a
You know,
couple that's funny though, because we're like almost a couple steps away from big government. Like maybe that is the next government client for you.
yeah, well, they are. I mean, some of them are our client. We have contracts with private sector players that act like government, and some of their revenue is, if you look at a Google revenue or a Tesla revenue, is bigger than the GDP of many countries. So yeah, these are huge organizations and they need a lot of money, but so do you. If you've got a company with 10, 20, 30 people, and you've got to understand that you don't just make AI happen. You don't just integrate it. When you integrate AI, you've got to often rebuild your own infrastructure, your own tech stack. You've got to review all your databases. You've got to bring in experts who understand how to look at your human workflows and then incorporate them into artificial or digital workflows. And then you bring process improvement people in because it's an opportunity to cut out waste. And if you don't do that, and a lot of people aren't doing that, Dalton, they're trying to cut corners, they're finding the AI is telling them what to do incorrectly. And they're finding that it's just not, it's adding complexity rather than taking it away. So they're saying the AI doesn't work, it's not there yet. You've heard it, you've seen it online. I guarantee you it works.
Yes.
It is there. But it's that I don't want to be the one to be blamed for it. And, there's so many companies now that have spent tens of millions of dollars on building technology, but the technology was built on a tech stack that's now 15 to 20 years old. And AI doesn't plug and play nicely with that. So if you are a CTO or a CIO listening to this, and you haven't moved over to like this micro service architecture, and if you're not technical, that's basically like Lego, where every little service within your technology has its own API, its own ability to integrate. It's going to be very hard. So first you have to do that. That's your foundation. And this requires massive capital. It's CapEx. CapEx is capital expenditure, and banks will lend for this because they see your products that you're building as assets. They're intangible, so they're not like buildings, but they see it in a very much the same way. And that's how companies, I believe, Dalton, will be valued in the near future. People will say, okay, with a little bit more AI, can we pro forma out how profitable this company could be? We've got to get through this situation now where the capital markets have screeched to a halt, and that's making it difficult for private equity and growth equity and VCs to invest. So that's the other thing you got to think about. What's your source of capital for this? Maybe that's your house. Maybe you're going to go and take a mortgage against it. Maybe it's just, you really like Wilmer and you really like Mildred and you've kept them around a long time, but they're both earning $60,000 and all in costing you with taxes and overheads $150,000. And maybe it's time for Wilmer and Mildred to retire, because for the greater good of the other 20 people you've got working for you, we need to take that money because we now need to bring in, a business process expert to map out our AI strategy.
No, I agree. One of the points that you had was people integrating AI and then being disappointed with the results. I think one of the key points is when you're training your system or trying to do an orchestration or automation of whatever process it may be, it could be digital, it could be human. If you're trying to do that, you've got to almost spend the same amount of time on that process with AI, these LLMs, than you would if you were onboarding an employee from scratch. Like whatever that process is, you've got to take the time and train and curate and get the data like perfect, get the process perfect, get the training recipe for the AI perfect, and take the time. But I think people think like, okay, well, AI is supposed to know everything, so then if I just give it some stuff, then it's going to know what to do, and like, that's not how it works. Like, you've got to be very strategic on the instructions and make sure that you don't input any bias, like, oh, I think, or you should do something like that. Because if you tell it like, I think you should do something like that, or like, I think you should suggest, it's just going to do what it asks, what you ask it to do. Like, that's a request. And there's a lot of things that you have to think about when you're setting those up. And I think a lot of times they're rushed. And once again, we talked about it a little bit, like there isn't a core skill set at every company. And so I think that there's not enough time and or expertise in those areas where it's just sometimes it falls flat, and then you're on the hook. Somebody's upset, and a lot of people are like, what? Well, it's just AI.
Yeah, and
It's
then the
AI's fault.
investors are looking for someone to throw under the bus, and usually it's the CEO or the CTO. I like to think of it as a car. It's a car engine, right? The AI is an engine. You go out and you buy AI from Gemini, you're getting an engine, a great engine. And, you've got to plug it in so that it can get fuel, that it can get cool air, that it can, you've got to get the timing of the spark exactly right. And if you flood it with fuel, the whole thing blows up. So you need just the exact right amount of fuel, and you got to put oil in because it can work really well for like 5 minutes with zero oil in. And then the whole thing will just, rip itself to shreds. So, when you go and buy these AI engines, just to your point, there are so many like parts to this. And that's why people don't want to bring in AI, even if they know how good it is, because it is so capital intensive and it's so hard. And you could bring in a brand new great engine, turn the key, and it can blow up if you get it wrong. And then you're back to the drawing board and you've upset a lot of clients. So, but again, this isn't quite an engine. I have faith in America and Europe's leaders and CEOs and CTOs to figure this out. Sometimes you will not know exactly what you're doing, but you will figure it out. And that's the entrepreneurial spirit that the Western world was built on. And it's the entrepreneurial spirit that the Eastern world is now been copying, and in many ways doing it just as well, if not better than us. So we just got to get back to what made us great, which is intrapreneurs, which are entrepreneurs who work for companies, and entrepreneurial spirit. And those folks are the ones that don't have to worry about AI taking their job, because the AI needs them more than the other way around.
Correct. And I think that's a great segue while we're closing out to the show, is just talking about like the truth about entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship, and really emphasizing the getting stuff done, or otherwise the adult version, getting shit done.
Yeah, no, it's funny because when my friends watch your podcast, they're like, "Oh, you actually have a job. I didn't really realize it was a serious job." And yeah, and I have my own like first person podcast where I do like ride alongs. And like, oh my God, you actually have an office and real people. I thought you were just BSing me. Because they don't see me as some kind of ivory tower suit. I know I'm in a suit today, but that's actually because I've got to go to a ceremony this afternoon. But that's what the new entrepreneur has to be, or CEO. You have to go and understand, and you have to get things done. And business is more fragmented. There is more questioning. There is more debate. And if you're not around it, if you're not in the weeds with your team, you're not going to be able to do that. In fact, just before I came on air with you, my head of security called me up and he said, they don't want you to join the tabletop exercise for our cyber defense. So every few months we do simulated ransom attack. And I said to him, what do you mean? I'm a key part of our operating procedures. And they say, well, it's a new company and they've never seen a CEO who's been part of the cyber defense. I said, well, who's going to go on television. I mean, I deal with courts and police stations for some of the biggest cities in Europe and medical for the biggest states in America. Like someone's got to go and deal with it. I've got to understand. I've got to be part of it. And who's going to make that decision to kill the server? Is it going to be you? And he's like, no, I'll make technical decisions, but I can't make some of those decisions. And it just goes to show how radically quick the job of being an entrepreneur and a CEO is changing. And you can't afford to be like, my father, who was a very successful businessman and sold companies for a lot of money, he used to say, don't show me spreadsheets. I don't understand them. Well, you can't get away with that these days. You've got to understand the technical data. It is a very technical game. And I liken it to, if you compare the very best quarterback in the NFL 100 years ago to the very worst quarterback in the NFL today, and this could be for any sport, by the way, the very worst is going to be significantly faster, fitter, more operational. And it's the same with entrepreneurs and CEOs and intrapreneurs. We have to be so much better than we would have had to be 30 years ago. But the good news is your kids are going to be able to say the same.
Josh, what a great episode. You absolutely crushed it with the analogies today. So many just hit the nail on the head. The car engine, the football players. You could do American football, you could do European football, however it may be. But that is a relatable topic for anybody and relatable to the next level of what it means to be a leader. Of course, wherever we are in this world, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. I think the last thing I forgot, Josh, if you want people to get in contact with you, how would you like that to be routed? Like, would you like people to reach out to you on LinkedIn, or do you have a contact?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm a LinkedIn whore, as they say. You can, I love contact. I love getting mail. You can search up Josh Gould, the big word. I have my own, like I said, talking head podcast called Execraft. So please make my day and subscribe to that. And make sure you're doing the same with Dalton's. He has a great show here.
Yeah, I'll plug that in as well in this show. Okay, so if you're interested in Josh's show, I'll plug that in, and then I'll also link his LinkedIn. Thank you, everybody.